Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my mini lecture. Today's topic is going to be focusing on education in a globalizing world, and more specifically, English language policies in South Korea. So I came up with some guiding questions to kind of streamline my thought process. So number one, why is English considered to be important in the globalizing world? Number two, how has South Korea implemented English instruction into their educational systems? Number three, how is the embrace of English by the South Korean government affecting its students? And four, how do native English speaking teachers, NEST, and or foreign professors, FPs, fit into the context of South Korean English instruction? So basically, why is English important? How has South Korea embraced English? How their embrace of English is affecting their students? And how do native English speaking teachers fit into this context in South Korea? So globalization has been increasing throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Bourdain talks about globalization as pointing to what is global as opposed to what is local. So in more layman's terms, it would be international versus intranational. And I think one of the main ways that most people see globalization manifesting is in the economies of certain countries. So economies are becoming more dependent on each other, but are also growing as well through this interaction and dependence on each other. So an example would be the United States and China trade deals, or NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so, a little more evidence of this increasing globalization is the creation of these very large global trade organizations, which oversee deals and negotiations between certain countries. So, one of the largest is the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. And so, the WTO releases an annual report, and in 2020, it covered activities from 2019 and early 2020. And so overall, the WTO conducted 164 trade negotiations among its 164 member countries. And so this shows a very large presence in international trade and by extension, globalization in their economies. So it's not just the very large economic powerhouses trading with each other, it's virtually every country engaging in these international trade deals and therefore contributing to globalization. And so South Korea has engaged in these international markets, and many of the products that we know today in the United States are from South Korea, and you might not even know that. So some examples may be Samsung, LG, Electronics, Kia Motors, and Hyundai, which is a result of South Korea trading their products to the United States, and then we sell them in the United States. And so these interconnected economies do not really occur in isolation, meaning that it does not only affect the economies of the countries that are involved in these trade deals and trade negotiations. There are many different aspects that are also involved. So markets, which is economies, is which is probably the one that most people think of when they think of globalization is sort of the main one. But other ones are government organizations, political economies, and education. So I'm going to be focusing on education and higher education for the purpose of this mini lecture. And so there's a term called academic capitalism, which refers to the notion that all aspects of education, which include student learning, educational governments, administrative strategies, public policies on education, and the academic profession as a whole, are somehow embedded in the political economy. And so there's one side effect of this academic capitalism is that many countries are who do not speak English as a primary first or official language are beginning to embrace learning English. And and some evidence for this is that master's programs in English have increased by over 1,000% in Europe over the last decade, and there's been a similar increase in East Asian countries such as Taiwan, China, Japan, and South Korea. And so these master's programs, which are conducted in English, usually focus on disciplines that we would refer to as STEM, so business, economics, engineering, technology, which are very important for economic growth and innovation, which shows kind of how they're using English in order to gain access to the global economy, and through doing so are creating or are increasing globalization. So why English? I think this is a very important question. So there may be a variety of different opinions out there as to why English has kind of emerged as the lingua franca for business in the modern world. But I narrowed it down to three that I think are most probable to why English is being embraced by countries who do not speak English as a first or official language. So the first is history. So one reason that English may continue to hold power as a quote common language may be due to historical factors such as the result of aggressive British and American imperialism, where English was forced on much of the world as a language of governance. If we take into account places like India or places like Hong Kong, the the British Empire really is not ancient history. I mean, there's many people alive today who lived under British rule and were forced to learn English, uh, not through choice but through force, obviously. And so this kind of lingering colonial viewpoint may be a reason why English is continued to be embraced as a common language. But not everyone believes that that is the case. So Matsumoto in 2013 argued that English as a common language is not really the result of historical factors, but is simply a result of increasing interaction between the West and the East due to due to increasing trade. And so a third reason, which I think may be the most probable, is that there's larger markets out there. So the United States holds an immense amount of economic power. And so in 2020, they had about the United States had about 20.9 trillion in GDP, and the or had about 20.9 trillion in GDP, compared to South Korea, who only had 1.62 trillion in GDP. And so it's much more enticing for South Korea to try to break into a larger market than vice versa, because more money being generated means more money being able to be spent on their products. And when considering that the United States population is about 330 million, uh, considering the fact that many of the people are probably too young to actually have jobs and purchase things, it's still a very large consumer base that they can use to sell their products. And so being able to break into these large markets of the United States requires the use of English, considering that most people in the United States do speak English as a first language. And this requires the use of English by South Korean businesses in order to interact with distribution companies such as Best Buy or Target or Walmart, things like that, and to be able to market their products because you don't really know what they're selling unless they're marketing their products effectively to you, and this requires the use of English. So, kind of regardless of the exact reasons why English has evolved as the lingua franca, English has emerged as a language that speakers of all varieties of language elect to use as a means of communication regardless of their native tongue. And so the use of English in this globalized context has actually been increasing due to technological advancements, such as communication networks that are faster and more efficient. And so communication networks such as Skype, telephones, conference calls, Zoom, things like that require the need for verbal language exchange between the two entities. This is often conducted in English due to it being the lingua franca of business. And so this increases international trade opportunities, employment opportunities, and of course, tourism. If you consider going overseas, most likely people who work in tourist fields or in hospitality or hotels normally speak English as a way of being able to connect to the broadest audience possible. And so this is not just occurring in East Asia or in India or places like that, but it's occurring in Europe as well. And European countries such as Portugal embrace English as their most widely used foreign language. So how has the growing importance of the English language affecting education, students, and parents? Well, one side effect of pushing for English instruction is that it requires parents to go above and beyond for their children in order for them to get the best education. And so in 1951, about 2.5% of the total public budget for South Korea was spent on public education, but that has increased to 15% in the 2000s. And so to kind of give a little bit of context for where that puts them in the global ranking, so South Korea ranks above the United States, France, Canada, and Australia in terms of total public expenditures on primary to post-secondary education as reported by the OECD in 2016. And so this helps students because it frees up monetary funds for the parents, and then the parents opt to use what is known as hagwons or Korean private schools that they view as giving their children a competitive edge over other students in areas of math, reading, writing, and English. And so, an example of how the increased budget may reduce the monetary strain on parents is that oftentimes, say you have a two-parent household and you have one student or one they have one child and they live in an area where the schools may not be the best or not to the standards that the parents want. So it's not uncommon for the parents to kind of split up with one parent staying in their hometowns and working and doing what they've always done, while the other parent takes their child to go live in a new city with better school systems in order to be able to compete nationally. And so by increasing the public expenditures, the average school quality has increased and parents don't really have to move across the country in order to get their students quality education. And so the extra money, or not extra money, but the money that they have available to them can now be spent on hagwons, which are Korean private schools. And it really, and the amount of students who are using these hagwons shows how important education is to these students, especially in math, reading, writing, and English. So 75% of middle and high school students attend Hagwons, 50.2% of Korean high schoolers and 69.4% of Korean middle schoolers participated in private education due to the decreased financial burden on families, which I just mentioned. And some students spend upwards of 14 hours per day in schools, Hagwons, and learning related facilities. And I really want to highlight English because English proficiency tests are a requirement for many top universities in South Korea in order to gain admittance. And so, therefore, it is very valuable for parents to put their students in these hagwons so that they can learn English so that they have kind of a competitive edge over other students who may not have as much time to practice and learn English. So, South Korea and Japan have embraced this idea that English language and education are an essential tool to achieve domestic and global success. So I've kind of already touched on global success in the context of interacting economies, being able to create, market, and sell products, but it also has a domestic success aspect to it. Uh, so one thing that South Korea has really been pushing for is they want to increase the rank and recognition of their universities. And so they want to raise their university ranks into the top 100 universities globally while also increasing international publications coming from South Korea. And the important part about this is that they really want their students to be able to read, write, and publish in English to kind of reach this more globalized academic community in order to gain more recognition for their universities. And so the value placed on being able to learn, know, read, speak, write English is displayed through the creation and implementation of EMI courses in their universities and in their public schools. So there's basically been two main policies that have been focused on English instruction in South Korea over the last 20 or 30 years. So the first one is known as the Study Korea Project. So this increased funding and financial support for universities who embrace EMI courses, whether mandatory or optional. And it's increasingly become a requirement to receive funding instead of receiving supplemental funding. So basically, it started out as if you have EMI courses, we're going to give you X amount of more dollars. But it has come more to if you don't have EMI courses, we're not going to fund you, so you better have EMI courses. And the second biggest policy is known as Brain Korea 21. And so the goal of this policy uh, was to increase the global competitiveness of research-oriented universities in South Korea by the year 2012. And so it basically increased the required EMI courses as well as encouraged students to write and publish their work in English, which I will expand more on in a little bit. So raising South Korea, so the policy was effective. It raised South Korea from 12th in university rankings to the top 10 in university rankings. And in 2009, South Korea had 3 universities in the top 100 universities globally. And so this may be the fact that by being able to speak and produce original work in English, maybe gaining them more recognition among the global academic community. But that's not to say that if they didn't embrace EMI courses, that their university systems wouldn't have improved in ranking as well. So there's some side effects to embracing English for the sake of the global competitiveness of the universities. And so students are often required or highly encouraged, but more often required to publish in English. But the reality does not really reflect the intended notion. And so students will find a way to work around having to publish in English by writing their work entirely in their L1, which in this case is Korean, and then hiring professional translators to convert them to English. So this frees up time for the students who are very overburdened already or um, who don't really have the English ability to write academically. But it may also lose the quality of the work due to poor translations by people who may not know the subject material very well, or simply translation issues. I mean, there may be words that exist in English that simply don't exist in South Korean. So having someone work around that uh, maybe might hinder the quality of the work. So another side effect of this push for embracing English and the global competitiveness of their university is that students who are not able to write and produce in English may be passed over for funding by the university, and faculty members may not receive tenure if they're unable to publish in English. So it's not really required, but if you want funding or to receive tenure, it is required. And so the university as a whole may even lose funding if they do not embrace EMI courses. And so students, if they're unable to speak and write in English, may kind of have this stigma against them because they're not able to reach a broader global academic community, which is the whole purpose of their embrace of English and using English both to get into the globalization side of both academic and economic means. So we've talked a lot about EMI courses, and this is kind of the main way that South Korea has implemented English into their educational systems. So EMI is English Medium of Instruction courses, and it's defined as the exclusive use of English language as the medium for instruction, course textbooks, and examinations. So the implementation of EMI courses is fairly new. It began in 2005 when South Korean Ministry of Education increased the amount of EMI courses available, both compulsory and elective. But there's been a mostly negative response of South Korean students to EMI courses, and this manifests in academic achievements, motivations, and attitudes. So, why is this negative response to EMI courses occurring? Well, a study by Chung, Kim, Park, McDonald, Ha, and Kim, 2017, attempted to uncover exactly how EMI courses affected South Korean students. So this study followed 187 undergraduate students at a South Korean university. The study utilized surveys on a volunteer basis, and it focused on 7 aspects associated with how South Korean students were affected by EMI courses. So number 1, foreign language anxiety. So this is anxiety experienced when communicating with or presenting to others in a second language. Language confidence, which is competence and self-efficacy. Perceived competence of the instructor, attitudes towards EMI courses, whether they view them favorably or non-favorably, EMI course avoidance, whether they don't want to take EMI courses if possible, EMI course grades, how well they do in the class, or content understanding, which is how well they learn the material that they were supposed to learn. And so basically, it was found that language anxiety was positively related to course avoidance, meaning the higher the language anxiety, the more willing the student to avoid the class. It was negatively related to course grades, meaning that the higher the language anxiety, the lower the course grades. It was negatively related to content understanding, meaning that language anxiety, the higher the language anxiety, the worse the content understanding, and was negatively related to course attitudes. So language anxiety, the higher the language anxiety, the worse attitudes the students had towards the class. So moving on to language confidence was positively related to course grades and was negatively related to language anxiety. So this means that the more confident students are in using their language, the higher their course grades and the lower levels of anxiety they would have in the classroom. So perceptions of instructors' English competence was also negatively related to language anxiety, meaning that if the students believed that the instructor was competent and good at English, it would lower their language anxiety. EMI grades were positively related to EMI attitudes, so the better the attitude of the students, the higher the grades. EMI content understanding was positively related to EMI attitudes, meaning that the better the attitude, the better the content understanding. And finally, EMI course attitudes were negatively related to course avoidance, meaning that course that the better attitudes the student had for the course, the more willing they were to take an EMI course. So that was a lot of findings from one study, but I think the main takeaway is that EMI attitudes and foreign language anxieties have the largest effect on how those students will react to taking EMI courses. So kind of moving on a little bit from EMI, there's also a lot of things that the South Korean government views as valuable for their English language policies. And so one of the big ones is being able to speak native like and as a native, which has really been a target of South Korea's last 3 national curriculums. And so this got me wondering, does native like proficiency really matter to South Korean students, or is it a wasted effort? And so I found a study by Choi in 2016, which observed 20 South Korean students at a research university here in the United States. And the researcher observed the participants, interviewed them, and held daily conversations with them. And the study actually found that non-native speaking proficiency did not negatively affect students academically or professionally in any way. The students claimed that it was much more important to possess the academic knowledge associated with what they are studying rather than being able to convey it as a native English speaker. So non-native speaking not really impact the students academically, but it did impact them socially. So students lacked casual communication skills and culturally specific knowledge. But even this aspect did not make the students feel as if they really needed to improve or overcome this obstacle. So overall, it seemed that speaking as a native was not a priority, sorry, for most students, but it is being pushed by the Korean government as something that is very important in their national curriculums. So one strategy that can be used instead in that is not really being used is that understanding that EMI courses and native like speaking proficiency are not really manifesting as intended. And so it's important to explore certain strategies that students or that teachers may use when trying to teach English. So one method that's really underutilized, which I found, was that South Koreans don't really use what is known as recreational reading or free reading. And so one study focused on 140 EFL students who were chosen to try this method. So the students were allowed to choose their own reading material rather than the reading material that was assigned to them, and they were then compared to a control group who were taught by the same teacher and who were on similar reading levels. So the findings suggested that the students who used free reading excelled in comprehension, vocabulary, sentence writing, and attitudes towards English. So if we relate back a few slides to the EMI courses, just this simple activity of being able to allow students to choose their own reading materials will in- increase their attitudes towards English, which will then decrease their language anxiety, which will then lead to higher course grades, higher content understanding, and things of that nature. So just one very simple step or one very simple strategy that is not quite being used has the potential to overturn the negative view that a lot of students have towards EMI instruction. So why aren't these strategies being used? Well, unfortunately, the quality of the average English teacher in South Korea is not as high as I would like to see it. And so there's this very their goal, and by they I mean the South Korean Ministry of Education, their goal is to just get as many native English speaking teachers into the classroom as possible. And by doing this, they kind of have to lower the standards a little bit so that the demand does not outsupply uh, or that the demand doesn't outpace the supply. And so one of the biggest recruiting agencies is known as EPIC, or English Persons in Korea. And it's the top recruiter of native English speaking teachers in South Korea, and it's government run. So they have about two intakes per year of 1,000 plus teachers, and they're very simple qualifications in order to get accepted into the EPIC program. So number one, you just have to have a bachelor's degree in any field. It doesn't have to be related to English or education at all. You have to have a TEFL certificate, which is teaching English as a foreign language, which can be completed in 90 days over through an online program. You have to hold a passport from a native English speaking country. This could be United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, places like that. Have no criminal background check, FBI check, which is pretty straightforward, and good in mental physical health, which is also pretty straightforward. And so the teachers who are selected and who pass the interview are required to write lessons plans themselves without much guidance. I mean, EPIC does supply native English speaking teachers with a Korean co-teacher, but this is more for classroom management and day-to-day activities and not really for teaching. And so this results in a very unstructured system with very inexperienced teachers. And if the teachers do not know about certain teaching strategies such as the free reading, which I just mentioned, then it may lead to lower language confidence and higher language anxiety in their students, which if we go back to the EMI um, the the reaction of the students to the EMI courses, then it shows that the higher the language anxiety, the more negative effects that it has on many other aspects, such as course grades, content understanding, etc. So, is recruiting native English teachers the best path forward? It really depends on who you ask. Through research, I found answers on both sides, but Choi 2016 argues that recruiting purely native English speaking teachers from a native English speaking country may lead to what is known as the native English speaking teacher fallacy, which counters the notion that the ideal teacher of English is a native speaker. This is due to the fact that while English speakers have learned English, they do not learn it as their first they learned it as their first language and therefore did not really understand the process of learning English as a second language. Non-native English speaking teachers, however, have gained insight into learners' needs in terms of language and culture, and therefore may be better qualified because they have gone through the process themselves and then therefore can have some empathy towards the students who are trying to learn English for the first time. So the EPIC program may be kind of on the wrong path looking forward because many people in South Korea still have difficulty communicating with native English speakers. But I think that if they increase the standards and maybe train the teachers a little bit better, then the confidence of the average student to speak in English will increase, which will lower language anxiety, which will help them to succeed in EMI courses down the road in college, and also being able to publish and speak and write in English um, in order to kind of contribute to this globalizing academic and economic community that they're so invested in. So, as kind of a segue, I guess, for lack of a better word. So, being a native English speaker does not disqualify a person from being an effective English teacher or EMI teacher. So South Korea, while they're recruiting a lot of native English speaking teachers, they're also recruiting a lot of foreign professors to teach these increasing uh, number of EMI courses at the universities. So since the 1990s, there's been a quote 15-fold increase in the number of foreign professors recruited in South Korea. So Jang 2017 attempted to discover how this influx of foreign professors have impacted student-teacher relationships. So they examined a computer architecture class with about 70 students. The professor was a white male who has taught in the United States, Canada, and Hong Kong, and the data was collected through surveys and self-evaluations. So the findings suggested that the atmosphere created by the professor was a key indicator of student participation. The professor created an enjoyable and exciting atmosphere that supported the use of Korean. The professor made a distinction between English and Korean. He referred to English as the language of instruction, whereas Korean was the language of learning. The professor was also fluent in Korean, and students said that his use of Korean acted as a gateway for students to enter a new space in which two languages and cultures were amusingly intermingled. One quote that he had was, "English is not a problem, the culture of teaching matters." He mentioned that faculty must adapt and bring in aspects of the local culture to be effective. So basically, some conclusions from this lecture is that the push for South Korea to become globally competitive, both academically and economically, is not going to really slow down anytime in the near future. And so, one of the avenues that they've committed to in order to achieve this global competitiveness is their embrace of English in their schools through EMI courses, through the recruitment of native English speaking teachers, through the increased educational budgets. Um, and so far, the response has not really been as positive as initially believed or accomplished the goals initially set forth. I mean, their university rankings have increased, but generally, South Korean students still have trouble communicating with a native speaker in English. And so I think that the focus on the wrong strategies So I think focusing on the wrong areas and utilizing the wrong strategies is something that uh, they can really more streamline and focus on better. And this is kind of comes from the reliance on native English speaking teachers who have no educational background or any training and education overall, which is kind of leading to this poor result in English. And so, a suggestion that I have is that the quality of English teacher must improve to improve the quality of English instruction. The unfortunate reality is that many people simply go to South Korea as a way of exploring instead of, you know, going there to teach. So teaching really comes second. So they're not really invested in finding new strategies that are effective in teaching students English. So finally, native English speaking teachers and foreign professors must utilize Korean culture in a responsible manner in the classroom. This includes bringing in the culture from their students into the lesson plan and facilitating the use of English as well as Korean in EMI classrooms where necessary. So here are my resources. I appreciate you watching uh, my mini lecture, and I hope I was able to give some background on why South Korea is embracing English, how they're embracing English in their education system, how it's affecting their students, and how teachers play into this aspect.